So I've been called here to take you through what trustees need to understand in setting their investment strategy. Some would say this is the IPS and the like will focus mainly on investments. With your setting your retirement objective, you're literally making sure that when you go to Woolworths today and buy your loaf of bread or your, chicken or whatever, in the next, or when you retire, you're still able to do the same thing. So you're literally trying to maintain your lifestyle. That's the goal that you should have as trustees, is to maintain the lifestyle of your members as they retire and hopefully throughout their retirement. And I'm going to take you through how you do that by setting a strategy with the right investments to meet the right goal. One of the things that you would do as trustees is a requirement by law is that each pension fund must have an IPS or investment policy document. This is the document that sets the scene on how you invest your assets and holds you accountable to the regulator. This is what you need to show to your members, that you're not just sitting there thumb-sucking exercise and allocating to random managers or allocating to random asset classes, and that you've actually thought about how their investments are going to benefit them into their retirement. How are you accountable to them in setting a strategy that invests in their best interest? NBFIRA insists on it. Some of the things that are in the Retirement Funds Act and in the PFR2 rules speak towards how much you can invest, the limits you can invest, the number of securities that you must have, and stop loss in trading. It also tells you that you can't borrow as a fund. It also limits certain asset classes to certain ranges. So for example, you'll find that offshore private equity is limited to about 5%, and some of the asset classes that are not catered for within PFR2 are bunched into miscellaneous items, and you've got to be cognizant of that and make sure that you're monitoring. But it's not for me to go into what the regulator has said you should do. That's a separate topic. What I'm going to focus on is the investments piece. We set an objective with trustees. So you set a goal. You then decide on the asset classes based on your membership and the actuarial data. So the strategic asset allocation, and then which is actually the core driver of returns. And then mandate or picking managers. As you can see, it's the smaller portion out of the core triangle. And then finally, tactical asset allocation, which is basically saying, if markets are performing in this way, we can tilt the portfolio slightly and, to get a greater return. So that is a smaller part of picking the strategy. So I'll take you through these, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. So you need to know exactly what it is that you're achieving with members. You need to be able to measure it. So performance reporting, holding people or managers to account, and setting benchmarks. It needs to be attainable. There's no point in saying you want a 20% return in a low-rate environment. So, and it also needs to be realistic as well. And obviously, it needs to be timely. There's no point in setting a strategy or setting asset classes or appointing managers and not moving quite quickly on them, because that affects your returns long term. Now, in terms of your investment objectives, you need to obviously set an objective, but you also need to think about what it is you're trying to achieve and at what cost, so at what risk. So is it important to have capital, which is your core, or the income at risk? which one are you going to protect first? So just imagine you had 100,000 pula, you put it into a fixed deposit. Like I remember maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the rates were a lot higher. Right now, you can't get, I don't know, somebody from the banks will confirm with me, but you can barely get 5% on a fixed deposit for that amount. So imagine you went from 10% a year, and then they drop rates at the Bank of Botswana. They decide to drop their rates, and then what do? You can't rely on a cash-only investment, but what are we trying to protect? If you're a retiree and you're living off of the interest that you would earn from the fixed deposit, you care whether the banks cut the rate by 10% to 5%. You're not necessarily worried about the 100,000 pula, are we? So does the strategy protect income or capital? What should you be protecting? And this is what you need to think about when you're thinking about your strategy or in setting a strategy for retirees. It's important to protect the income. Income is important to protect, and why? Because of what I explained before, you'd like to be able to still buy your bread or loaf of bread from Woolies, 10 or 20 years down the line. You still want to be able to afford it into retirement. And this is just an example of what the cost of living and the changes or the price increase of just basic goods or eating out, which could feed into that. So it's important to think about the income and think about protecting the income and making sure that the income grows in line with inflation when setting the strategy. So what do members in retirement want? What do members want in retirement? They want to be able, obviously, to protect their income, and the only way you're able to do that is to make sure you have the right assets. So it's basically a balance sheet. You're looking at the assets that you have now, and then the liability is the liability of the pension. So now we'll talk through the strategic asset allocation, and different asset classes will give you different returns based on the risk. So cash, the safest one. Obviously, if you put your money in the bank, you'll get whatever deposit rate that you'll get, and you'll find your money there tomorrow. Bonds, the same. The government issues bonds. You earn a coupon or a payment. It's guaranteed the government will pay. And then equities, it's slightly more risk. Obviously, as we saw, Choppies, the share price fell significantly, even went down from 40 to 40 cents. And I know people who went in at the initial offering of 1 pula. So you can see that equities, whilst they can give you a high return, they're also taking on considerable amount of risk. So we've done a lot of work locally. Botswana cash is a low returning asset class in real terms, so this is considering inflation. And then you can see something like Africa, for example. Africa, as an investment, provides you a high return with obviously a high risk. And then what's important to note is the liability. So we've got a lot of member data because we've got a large member base from our clients, and we're able to produce what the liability should be for Botswana clients. And typically, what we've seen, if you can see that 3.43, 8.68 coordinate, that's the liability of your pension. So we would do a model that would generate that. So what our aim is then to do is to get the right mix of these asset classes to match that liability, because that's what we need to give to members. Some asset classes, when mixed with others, vary in terms of their return. So it's showing you that, for example, the reds is that they're correlated, so they move in the same direction. So you've got a higher return for a certain asset class if it's if it corresponds to another red, it means that they move together. And then if they're anti-correlated, it's the blue shade, which means that the asset classes move in opposite direction. Now, this is important for building portfolios because you can build a really good portfolio if you have the right mix of asset classes. And this is the core driver of returns. Once we have the core mix of assets, we can pick the most efficient mix. And that's done on an efficient frontier, and it's modeled. So this is actually done for a client of ours, and you can find the best mix of asset classes with the lowest level of risk. And then finally, once you've done that, once you've picked your asset classes, you know, your bonds, your equities, your local managers, and things like that, you can then go and look at picking managers. And this is the part that most people enjoy because it requires on-site due diligence, which might obviously correlate with offshore visits and the like. But essentially, these are the key things that you need to look at in picking managers. Obviously, the structure of their business, is it a sustainable business? What is their philosophy? You know, what's the differentiating factor with their investment strategy? How do they add to the portfolio as a whole? And finally, the investment team, investment decision makers, do they have a broad team? Is there depth? Is there key person risk? Those are things that you should all be looking at. But you know, key man risk is not necessarily an issue if you've got a star portfolio manager and is shooting out the lights. You've just got to manage that risk, know it, and potentially have a different manager who's going to offer a different style to protect you from that. So things need to be looked at in context of your broader portfolio. So the final outcome, you'll have an excellent investment strategy. The other thing to consider, which is important, which I should have touched on earlier, is consider what type of mandates you want to give. If your fund is large enough, as RisCura believe in specialized mandates, we believe that if somebody's an expert at local equities, they're not necessarily going to be as good in picking a more balanced portfolio. We've done some work on this in some of our larger markets, and we've found that a specialized approach, where possible, does add value. And so we tend to gear towards the specialized mandates as opposed to the balanced mandates. But it needs to make sense for you as trustees. It works really well when there's a ManCo or an investment team within the fund to manage this, because there's no point in having 20 managers and you're only a board of 11 to sign off on documents. So it's important that things be taken into context. So then finally, we have tactical asset allocation. This is when we pick tilts within the portfolio. So for example, right now we've gone through the coronavirus debacle. This is an opportunity for clients to be invested in China. And Chinese equities are quite cheap at the moment. So we would, if there is time and expediency within the trustees, the board, be suggesting to our clients, please put money into China. This is the right time to invest. I mean, we're not trying to time the market, but there are tactical decisions that you can make given timing.